How's that for a musical intro? Alright, we had to start off a little lighthearted there because we're going to be doing some pretty heavy hitting here, some pretty heavy lifting. Oh, my guitar won't stand up over there. Oh man, we've got this feller. Who is he? He's a filthy heretic, huh? And he has a video called Property Rights from First Principles and How to Prove Me Wrong. Now, the video is 9 minutes and 29 seconds long, so it couldn't possibly take us more than 2 to 3 hours to get through it. So let's begin.
So how does libertarianism work? So how can we possibly prove the existence of property rights and defend them as foundational cores of our philosophy? They stem from first principles. So long as your argument derives itself from these axioms, then you don't actually need empirical evidence, because they could only possibly be wrong if the first principles are wrong. Now these ideas stem from Shane Killian's video on the same derives itself from these axioms, then you don't actually need empirical evidence. Cores of our philosophy. They stem from first principles. So long as your argument derives itself from these axioms, then you don't actually need empirical evidence, because philosophy.
That's a little
they
worrying.
Stem from first principles. So long as your argument derives itself from these axioms, then
first principle, and then he says it's an axiom. Well, is a first principle or an axiom?
Actually need empirical evidence, because they could only possibly be wrong if the first principles are wrong.
First of all, how would you establish the first principles? But second of all, what claims would they make then about the world? Okay. So he says this stem. Now, is he basing his video off of that idea? If he's basing his video off of that idea, that's very worrying. Or does he say that that's...
Now, these ideas stem from Shane Killian's video on the same topic. Link in the description. First principles shouldn't need to be defended. Now, that's quite a claim, that any argument could be beyond reproach. Well, let's take a look at these.
You don't have to back your principles with evidence if you use first principles and you never contradict them. Now, that is rationalism. First off, that's rationalism. Secondly, you cannot get to any principle at all, first or derivative, without checking with reality and using the senses. And you can't verify it without going back to reality. Now, what is an axiom? Is that what his problem is? He doesn't understand what an axiom is? That might be the problem. He might not understand axioms.
And see if you can refute them. Good luck. The basic, most foundational principle is also the foundational principle of all reason and logic. The principle of non-contradiction.
Okay, now the principle of non-contradiction is the rule of non-contradiction, which is a detail within formal logic or within the rules of logic. Now, in order to get to the rules of logic, Aristotle went through mathematics. So, mathematics is based on sensory evidence of 2 plus 2 equals 4. So, that is a derivative of mathematics. That right there. Okay? His first rule is non-contradiction is a derivative of mathematics. It occurs within the field of mathematics, and after we notice the things that construct mathematics. Okay, let's see. I mean, if that's your first principle, you've got 1,000 assumptions in your pocket already. You're on a very, very highly developed principle right there. That's not a first principle. That's not an axiom, and that's nothing to base anything on. This comes way after you've already discovered lots of stuff. Then you say, oh, there's this thing called contradiction, which we shan't do. But that's a very developed thought. Now, are they really starting with that as their first idea, their first basic principle?
This one's pretty intuitive. Something cannot contradict itself. An apple cannot also not be an apple. An apple cannot also be an orange, as what makes something an apple is mutually exclusive with what makes it an orange. Now, this is always true. This apple will continue to not be an orange, regardless of whether it is in New York City, see what I did there, Tokyo, or in orbit around Alpha Centauri. What I just described is called the consistency principle. If an argument fails on consistency, then it must be false. In a true dichotomy, where something is either an apple or an orange, all you have to do is falsify that it is an orange to prove that it's an apple. We know this is true because consistency is preferable, which we further know to be true because, well, consider the opposing statement. Consistency is not preferable. It contradicts itself.
Oh, and then you would be back to number 1, so you can't do that. This is floating rationalism. They're just connecting stuff in the middle of air without even... Now, is consistency a principle? Or is consistency just something that we notice in things that are correct and true? Right? You don't use consistency as a principle, do you? If you're principled, you will be consistent. So they've put the cart before the horse, haven't they? So, consistency is not a principle. Consistency is something that you do if you are principled. It wouldn't... what principle would it apply to? Consistent in what? Consistent in murdering people or in saving their lives? Consistent in what? So consistent itself is not a principle. It's consistent in what? It applies to something. Consistent in what? Just be consistent? You've got to flesh that out a lot more. That's garbage. That's not a principle. That's not a principle. So, first of all, you start off with a long derivative of mathematics, and then you just pull consistency out as a thing, and you're going to worship consistency as a thing. Because it's a detail that... Now, if you ask yourself why consistency is important, you might start to get somewhere. Why is it important to be consistent? Because then we would be, if we weren't consistent, then we would be contradicting reality. But we've already dispensed with that sort of thinking at the very beginning when we said we don't need to check with reality, we don't need evidence because we're working from first principles. Well, this second one here says that you need to check with reality constantly. How do you like that? You're fucking wrecked. Are you kidding me? This better get better.
Also saying that it is consistently true that consistency is not preferable. Therefore, it is falsifiable. And the consistency is preferable statement must be correct.
You're just word salading. You're just word salading. You're saying, well, consistency is good. Because if I said consistency is bad, that would mean consistency is good and consistency is bad. So consistency must be good. So consistency is good. Very sophisticated. Really? Okay, consistency, as I said, is something that applies to principles. It is not a principle. Consistency is something you get if you're principled.
The two are a true dichotomy. Only one of them could be correct. Therefore, the consistency principle. Now that we have our two first principles,
oh God,
let's
really?
apply them to interpersonal relationships.
Really? So you're going to take that garbage right there? You're going to take a derivative of mathematics that Aristotle found in order to make formal logic, which is pretty iffy. Formal logic is pretty iffy stuff. Even now, even the advanced systems we have now that are quite better than what Aristotle came up with, is still a little weird stuff. And you're going to take one of the principles out of that system as your rule number one. And your second principle is just to be consistent? About what? What are you being consistent about? About not contradicting yourself. And you've already dispensed with checking with reality at the very beginning. Now you're going to launch into interpersonal relationships. Wow. Okay. The burden of proof is on the active side, not the passive side. Oh, God. So now we have to flesh out and define what active and passive are. The burden of proof is on he who makes a claim. Activity and passivity are just, what is that? What is that? What? He was active. He was passive. What is that? Let's let him try.
The proof. Any action has two sides, a passive side and an active side.
Any action has two sides, a passive side and an active side. So you can either do or not do anything. Now that is not the beginning of any thought. That is beneath the notice of philosophers. That everything could either be done or not be done is not the beginning of some principle or any way to integrate anything, but let's give him a chance.
What if I told you the passive side had to justify their inaction? It couldn't be done. Think of all the things that you aren't doing right now. Driving an Abrams tank, skydiving, walking on the surface of the sun. The number of things you aren't doing right now is infinite. You couldn't possibly justify not doing everything. Therefore, the only consistent argument is that if you aren't doing anything, then you don't have to justify anything. Therefore, the burden of proof is always on the active side, not the passive side.
Yeah. So if you're not active, then you shouldn't have to justify yourself. Therefore, if you're active, that's who should have to justify themselves. And the active ones. Well, who, if we claim that there's a God, is that the active side? The active side has to justify the idea that there's a God. The people who are just sitting there, the atheists, they don't have to justify it. Is that how you look at it? Like, what is this rationalization of active and passive being riveted on and hammered onto centuries of philosophical language? You don't think you're going to get into some sort of trouble by making up a new term, active and passive? Let's see.
That's not to make moral judgments about the active side always being wrong. That's absurd. All that burden of proof argues is that if a passive side is wrong, the burden of proof is on the active side to prove it. Now, force, by definition, is active. Therefore, those advocating for force have the burden of proof. If you're minding your own business, I have to...
Okay, I can see. This is just a web of strange rationalization. Those advocating force have the burden of proof. What? Why? Because it's a positive. Because, okay, now the question that's going to have to occur is why do I have to justify the use of force? All right? Now, objectivists are going to say because each individual has an inviolable right to their own mind, and if you use physical force against them, that violates their mind. They can't think for themselves, and that violates their right to their own mind. That's what objectivists say. Now, since that's too abstract and too amazingly complex for them, they've got to figure out this garbage. So when I advocate force, I say either they were violating my rights or they're planning to violate my rights or something like that. That's what if I were to advocate force. He's saying if somebody advocates force, they have the burden of proof. Why? Because it's a positive action. Now, everything about epistemology and the nature of man's mind and independence and moral agency, thrown out the window with this. Thrown completely out the window. Where is it? He's getting all the way up here to ethical injunctions with no thought for what is a human being and what is the nature of a human being and how does a human being live. Not even a thought is given to what is a human being. And here he is really, really relying on human beings because If you advocate force, you have a burden of proof. Why? Because it would be immoral otherwise. Why? Because that's an active thing. Remember, the passive doesn't have to justify itself. The active has to justify itself. Maybe we should go back and ask what the word justify even means in that sentence. What does that even mean? To justify. Why would you have to justify yourself? What authority would say that you have to justify yourself? To be consistent and not violate rule number 1. Well, who said rule number 1? Oh, we're doing this to be consistent. That's right. Now, why aren't we checking with reality as we go? Oh, we've dispensed with that. We're just being consistent. We don't worry about reality. We're just being consistent. You're not worried about checking with reality? We don't have to justify it with evidence. We're just being consistent. Doesn't matter if it flushes with reality. We are consistent. It's pretty garbagey. Pretty garbagey.
Justify any action I take against you, or wish to have done to you. Let's use a random example. Say I want to take your money. Because everything I've described so far is absolutely logically consistent, I cannot avoid having to justify my actions without rejecting all of reason entirely.
Okay. So you have to justify your action of taking their money. Here's how you justify it. When you hit them on the head with your club, they collapsed. Justified. There. How is that not a justification? Answer me. How is that not a justification? I am justifying taking their money because I hit them on the head and they collapsed. Now I can have their money. Well, why would that not be an appropriate? Because why would that contradict something? Would that take us back to rule 1 and I'm contradicting myself? Or would that violate the consistency principle? I can't consistently run around hitting people on the head and taking their money. What if I did run around hitting people on the head and taking their money consistently? Okay, so the IRS, what does it mean to justify? Justify comes from the word justice. And justice means to give the just deserts to a person. And a person is an individual with a mind and with rights. So the word justify, to justify your actions, is a multi-layered concept that comes from a context. It comes from a context. And they are dropping all context of everything because they said they're not checking with reality.
Violating the consistency principle, even if I call myself a government. From this, we get that the initiation of force cannot be justified.
There's a lot simpler way to it, guys. Well, that's no way to it at all. That didn't say the initiation of force can't be justified because I just went in there and I said I justified it. I went and hit him on the head. The initiation of force can't be justified? Why? I went and hit him on the head and he fell down. How does that not justify it? Where in all of that garbage can I not go hit somebody on the head? It's not justified? I wouldn't be logically consistent? Is that where it is? I missed the part where I can't go hit people on the head and take their stuff. Shall we rewind and see what I missed? I'm going to go back a ways. Why can't I hit somebody on the head and take their stuff?
Preferable statement must be correct. After all, the two are a true dichotomy. Only one of them could be correct. Therefore, the consistency principle. Now that we have our two first principles, let's apply them to interpersonal relationships. Burden of proof. Any action has two sides, a passive side and an active side. What if I told you the passive side had to justify their inaction? It couldn't be done. Think of all the things that you aren't.
So I have to justify my action. That's the key. I can't go and take your dinner from you by force until I justify my action. That's the key. Okay, all right.
Right now, driving an Abrams tank, skydiving, walking on the surface of the sun. The number of things you aren't doing right now is infinite. You couldn't possibly justify not doing everything. Therefore, the only consistent argument is that if you aren't doing anything, then you don't have to justify anything. Therefore, the burden of proof is always on the active side, not the passive side. That's not to make moral judgments about the active side always being wrong. That's absurd. All that burden of proof argues is that if a passive side is wrong, the burden of proof is on the active side to prove it.
Okay, so I have to justify my action, and the burden of proof is on me because I'm active. I'm going around hitting people on the head and taking their dinner, and I have to justify it. Okay, got it.
Now, force, by definition, is active. Therefore, those advocating for force have the burden of proof.
All right, so I'm advocating for force because I'm going around and hitting people on the head and taking their money. And I have the burden of proof because I'm active. Just following through his garbage. I'm just trying to figure out why I can't hit people on the head and take their stuff.
If you're minding your own business, I have to justify any action I take against you.
Okay, so I have to justify the action I take against you. Okay.
To have done to you. Let's use a random example. Say I want...
Alright, now, I have to justify the action that I take against you because I'm the active agent. Okay. The justification I give is that I want your stuff. Why can't I take your stuff? I don't see where I can't.
To take your money. Because everything I described so far is absolutely logically consistent, I cannot avoid having to justify my actions without rejecting all of reason entirely.
Okay, so I have to justify my actions, alright? Fine, so I have to justify my actions. Okay.
Violating the consistency principle, even if I call myself a government. From this, we get that the initiation of force cannot be justified.
No, that didn't quite follow. That did not quite follow. All you said is that I have to justify myself. And then you said I have to justify myself because I'm active. And then you said the initiation of force cannot be justified. Let's go over that again. I missed something. Did I miss something? I don't know. I don't think I missed anything.
Money. Because everything I've described so far is absolutely logically consistent, I cannot avoid having to justify my actions without rejecting all of reason entirely.
Okay, so you have to justify your actions.
Violating the consistency principle, even if I call myself a government. From this, we get that the initiation of force cannot be justified.
I just did not follow that. Was there anything there? What did I miss? I'm going to go back one more time. That's at 3 minutes and 43 seconds. I'm going to go back to 3:13, and I'm going to give him 30 seconds in a run-up to this thought. Hell, I'm going to go back to 3 minutes. I'm going to give him some good time. And I'm going to see where he gets that.
Passive side is wrong. The burden of proof is on the active side to prove it.
Okay, I'm hitting people on the head.
Force, by definition, is active.
Okay, I'm hitting people on the head.
Those advocating for force have the burden of proof.
Okay,
if you're
I have to prove what I'm doing. Okay.
Your own business, I have to justify any action I take against you.
Okay, my justification was I'm poor or I'm hungry.
Or wish to have done to you. Let's use a random example. Say I want to take your money. Because everything I've described so far is absolutely logically consistent, I cannot avoid having to justify my actions without rejecting all of reason entirely.
Fine, I'll justify my actions. I'm hungry, and I think that you're an anarchist, and I don't think you're smart, so I'm going to come hit you on the head, okay? I've justified my actions. Now what?
Violating the consistency principle, even if I call myself a government.
Okay, so I would be violating the consistency principle if I didn't justify my actions. Okay, I'm justifying my actions, alright? I'm hungry and I think that you're stupid, so I'm going to hit you on the head and take your dinner. There, my actions are justified. Now what?
From this, we get that the initiation of force cannot be justified.
We never got there. We never got there. I am on my way over to your house to hit you on the head and take your dinner because I think that you're a stupid anarchist and you're talking in circles and you just said that I have to justify what I'm doing, therefore I cannot initiate force. I'm afraid I'm going to come right over and hit you right on the head.
Gee, this sounds familiar. Think about the statement in reverse. The initiation of force can be justified. If so, then what right do I have to complain about?
All right, now just to clarify, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not saying that the initiation of force can be justified. I'm saying he has done nothing to stop me from hitting him on the head. He hasn't said a single thing in there that would stop me from coming in. I mean, if I followed his philosophy and believed it, there's not a single thing in there that would stop me from going and hitting people on the head and taking their dinner. I worked at it. You saw me. You were with me. We went through it.
Punch in the face if I punched someone else in the face earlier. The only consistent application is civil aggression, where all initiation of force is always justified. It must therefore argue that those not aggressing, the passive side, are always in the wrong for not aggressing to satisfy the burden of proof. And there are many things you could do that aren't aggressive. Eating, sleeping, or even being the last person alive with nobody to aggress against. So the justification of the initiation of force cannot satisfy the consistency principle. Therefore,
Okay, so the question of whether or not we can initiate force against other people comes down to an application of the consistency principle. The junky, crappy, garbagey consistency principle. That is what protects you from people initiating force against you. The consistency principle, which isn't a principle. Consistency is something that applies to people who are principled. It is not a principle itself. And that's all that's standing between me and the initiation of force against me, is that it's not logically consistent.
Initiation of force cannot be justified. This is the...
You say it can't be justified because it's not logically consistent? That's your protection? That's how you protect your rights in your life? Say that's not logically consistent.
Proof of the non-aggression principle, the basis for all libertarian thought and policy.
Yeah,
you cannot refute the non-aggression principle without finding either a flaw in my chain of logic,
which I have just destroyed. Your chain of logic. Never has the word chain less appropriately been used. What shall we call it? Your dung heap of... It does not rise to the level of logic, sir. Your dung heap of rationalizations. Thinking in circles in your mind like you're doing anything at all. Sir!
Or refuting the law of non-contradiction. That is your only recourse to proving anything I said to be incorrect and refuting the foundation of libertarian thought.
All right, is there more? All right, should I keep going? Oh.
Now let's go to the fun stuff. Property rights.
Okay.
Property rights are derived from self-ownership. If you don't...
Property rights are derived from self-ownership. What's self-ownership derived from? No, you just own yourself. And then you can own property, too. Well, who owns yourself? You do. Who's you? The person who does the owning. What do you own? You. I've heard of this junk. That's like trying to put your own feet on top of your own head. That's stupid.
Self, and who does? If you're paying attention, yes, that's slavery. But who gets to own slaves, and who is made to be a slave? To make these distinctions is to create an inconsistency in how slavery is applied.
Look, is there a concept called ownership? If there's a concept called ownership, define it. What does it mean? Now, once you've defined ownership, go back and see if that concept applies to owning yourself. It doesn't. Ownership is an action done by an entity that can own. The entity doesn't own itself. That's stupid. And when you start off with a stupid junk idea like that, you don't get anywhere with it. You just stand on your own head. You put your feet wrapped around on your head like a pretzel doing this.
Say that nobody owns you. Ownership implies control of what happens to it. So if nobody owns you...
Of course nobody owns you, because humans aren't property. So nobody owns you. Of course not. There was a disgusting slave society in the South once, and we fought a war and destroyed and crushed them. Of course nobody can own you. Humans aren't property. Nobody owns humans. They don't even own themselves. They own things.
Anyone can do anything to you, including murdering you, and we've already talked about the problem with aggression. The only consistent answer is that you own yourself. Your body, mind, thoughts, and that which derives from them, as well as the right to defend yourself from aggressors.
All right. So he has a right to defend himself from aggressors. Still, there's nothing that says that I can't or shouldn't go hit him on the head. There's nothing that stopped me in there. This is real junk. Now, it's what I've said can't be refuted by the guy, so I don't expect to hear from him.
From self-ownership, we get private property. When you pick an apple, it is your thoughts and your body that brought the apple from the tree to your...
Oh, they've got a shopping list of things that they like about capitalism. They just pick and choose like a little laundry list, and then they come dancing and prancing around like a kindergartner scribbling on the wall with crayons, thinking that they've achieved something. This is garbage. This is garbage.